Chamber UK is joined today by Daverich, Director of Policy for CST, and Joani Reid, Chair of the Antisemitism APPG, to explore the pressing issue of antisemitism in the UK. Alarming figures reveal that nearly 2,000 of anti-Semitic hate incidents were recorded in just the first half of this year. That's the highest number ever reported in this period. In light of this, our discussion will focus on the policy measures needed to safeguard British Jews and strengthen social cohesion across the country. Thank you so much for joining us today. Should we start with some introductions? Dave, would you like to kick us off?
I'm Director of Policy at Community Security Trust, CST, which is a Jewish charity that seeks to protect the Jewish community across the whole of the UK from anti-Semitism, terrorism, and related threats. We do this through providing physical security at synagogues and Jewish schools and other Jewish buildings across the country. We help to pay for security measures. We work in partnership with the Home Office to manage a protective security grant from the government that contributes £18 million a year towards the cost of security measures at Jewish schools and other buildings across the country. We support victims of anti-Semitic hate crime, and we try and promote research and understanding of what anti-Semitism is to help come up with policy ideas and measures to counter it.
Hi, I'm Joani Reid. I'm the Member of Parliament for East Kilbride and Straven, brand new Member of Parliament, but an even newer Chair of the APPG against anti-Semitism. I should probably start by saying I am slightly self-conscious that I'm doing this with Daverich, who has got to be the UK's, if not the world's, preeminent thinker on these issues, and I come from an entirely different perspective of it. It's one that isn't as knowledgeable as David's, but I very much from the left. I grew up on the left. I've been involved in the Labour Party most of my adult life. I've witnessed it. I've been exposed to anti-Semitism from a very young age, and I'm deeply concerned about it, and I want to do everything that I can to help in the fight against it. So that's the perspective from which I come from this, and why I was delighted to accept the chairmanship of the APPG. But in terms of really understanding what is a hugely complex subject, David's your man.
That's great. Thank you, Joani. So just for our first topic of discussion, would you guys both like to discuss what you think the main cause behind this sharp rise in anti-Semitism is, and also how effective you believe the government and institutions have been or are in addressing it?
Firstly, Joan is too kind in what she says, but I'm really honoured and happy to be in this discussion with her, because this partnership between communities and government and members of parliament to come up with solutions to these problems is really, really important. And having these different perspectives and having allyship and support is really important to communities. And so your role stepping forward to chair the APPG on anti-Semitism, I think sends a really important message and puts you in a really important role. Look, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish hatred, to a certain extent, it's always been around, and there are always hate crimes targeting Jewish people, as there are different minorities, that kind of rumble along in the background at a certain level, and then things happen either in Britain or in the world, and suddenly they spike out of nowhere, and they start to affect loads of different areas of Jewish life and loads of individual Jewish people's lives in a way they just haven't done before. And the obvious reason why that has happened over the last year is in the way some people in this country have responded to the Hamas terror attack on Israel on the 7th of October last year, which killed 1,200 Israelis and they took 250 hostages. And then the subsequent war in Gaza, which has killed tens of thousands of people and seemingly no end in sight. And now, as we're talking, there's escalation in conflict in Lebanon as well, when there's been rumbling conflicts over the northern border of Israel between Israel and Hezbollah, and all these things going on in the Middle East. We've seen in the past, when war happens involving Israel, we get big spikes in anti-Semitism here in Britain. And it's something that is such a common pattern that we almost grow used to it. And on 7th of October, we expected it. But we should never accept it as normal. And it's not something that ever really happens with any other foreign conflicts. It's just conflicts involving Israel. And there's been a similar kind of increase in anti-Muslim hate crime as well. Also triggered by the way other people are responding to the conflict. And everything feeds back to that, really. And that, as that trigger event, as we call it, while that is rumbling on, there's constantly more fuel being thrown on to keep the pot boiling. And so the levels of anti-Semitism are still, to this day, higher than they were before 7th of October last year. Now, the question of how effective government and institutions are addressing it might be one for Joani to answer more than me. But one thing I would say is it's always very difficult to answer because we don't know how bad things might look if government and institutions were doing nothing. Because the government does do a lot, and successive governments under different parties have continued very similar policies, actually, in terms of providing funding for security guards at Jewish schools and synagogues and other buildings. We have very strong laws against hate crimes, against hate speech. There are other institutions, I think, outside of government and police that probably could do more kind of what is civil society doing in this space to really see anti-Semitism as a type of racism that really ought to be a priority to address. And I think in some ways, lots of people focus on government and the police and expect them to solve everything. And of course, they could always do more. There are always things we could look at with the police and say, well, they could have done this better, they could have done that better. But I think sometimes people who, there are people in other parts of society and institutions in other parts of society, trade unions, big companies, religious bodies, human rights groups, who could be doing an awful lot more and don't really do anywhere near as much as police and government do when it comes specifically to tackling anti-Jewish hatred.
Great, thank you, Dave. And Joani, for your thoughts.
That was very comprehensive from Dave. I mean, what I would say is that ultimately the cause of anti-Semitism is anti-Semites, but we do know that there's sharp rises when there's conflict in the Middle East, because consciously or subconsciously people kind of lean into anti-Semitism in those circumstances. And what I found really distressing about the incidents, the figures, is that it was only a few hours after the news of the terrorist attack by Hamas hit the headlines that we started to see that real spike in anti-Semitism. But of course, and I reiterate this, that the cause of it is individuals who are anti-Semitic rather than a kind of wider problem. I think it's driven by and enhanced by lots of different societal factors, but individuals need to be held to account and individual responsibility needs to be taken. There's lots of things that government can do, but this is crucially, I think, a problem for everyone, and that's why I've chaired the APPG, which cuts across all parties and across Parliament and isn't just left to government. It's had 2 inquiries under its previous chairman, John Mann, and they had about 60 recommendations. And we've seen some really good action from that. Changes in how we report hate crime, the judicial bench book updated so that judges are more thoughtful on sentencing around anti-Semitism and think about anti-Semitism. And there's a lot of work to be done around how police treat anti-Semitic hate crime, and there's work being done on that at the moment. I think the problem underneath all of that, and why it's a problem for everyone, is because it's cultural. And I'd actually hate the term cultural shift, cultural change, because it doesn't really get to any kind of tangible action. What we're talking about is behaviour and how people behave. And I think it's on all of us to stand up and hold people accountable for their behaviour, whether it's at Labour Party conference where we saw the most vile anti-Semitism outside just the other day, with a sign of a Star of David with a cross through it and blood dripping from it, saying that the Labour Party was controlled by Zionists. Every person who passed that should have called that out and spoken to the police. And lots of people did, but not everyone. And I think we have to call it out. So that behavioural shift is really, really important.
Yeah, thank you, Joani. And wow, that's truly shocking. Kind of on that point of behavior and how behavior is influenced, especially among younger age groups. Our next kind of topic focuses on how social media contributes to the spread of anti-Semitism and kind of what can be done and what should be done about that, especially amongst the younger population. Dave, would you like to speak about this?
I mean, social media plays such an important role in this, as it does in all parts of our lives, in the same way that so much of what we do, including recording this right now, is online. Everything is online. So anti-Semitism is online, and the way that things work on social media shapes how people understand the world. It shapes and influences what people believe is true and not true, what they see as sources of information they will believe and others they will dismiss. And because social media platforms are designed by algorithm to feed people with what the platforms think will keep them on the platforms, which is different from designed to give them what they like. Quite often they're designed to give them what make them angry, because that keeps them on the platform. But it's just what's designed to keep you on the platform because that makes money. So it channels people down ever more and more extreme kind of pathways, and sort of these piles of information build up that build you a narrative about Jews, about Israel, about Zionism, about all these conspiracy theories. And one of the consequences of this is we've seen in a lot of opinion polling that, broadly speaking, younger people are more likely to believe conspiracy tropes about Jewish people than older people are.
Yes.
And this ought to be the other way around, right? Younger people in many ways are becoming less racist, less prejudiced. And yet when it comes to, if an opinion poll asks the question, do you believe Jews control the banks, or Jews control the media, or the government, or whatever? People under the age of, say, 35 are more likely to agree with that than people over the age of, say, 55.
Yeah.
And this correlates to how much they rely on social media for as a source of information. And this is a real problem, because this is a generational problem that is starting to build beneath the surface. It's still only a minority of people, but with some of these issues, it's quite a worrying minority in terms of size, not a specific minority, but in terms of the numbers. And we have learned over many, many years of engaging with social media companies that you cannot rely on them to fix this for themselves, because either they try and deny the problem, or they avoid bringing in rules to fix the problem, or they bring in what on paper look like very good rules, but then they don't apply them properly or consistently. And all of these come down to the same root, that basically there's no incentive, there's no business incentive to doing these things, which is where you need regulation. So now we have the Online Safety Act, and the big challenge now is that act actually going to make a difference? Is it going to have the teeth? Is Ofcom going to be assertive enough as a regulator? Are the tech companies going to find ways to dodge around it? They're already making it harder and harder for people to research what goes on the platforms. They're closing down different sort of research tools and avenues because they're trying to hide what goes on there. So it's this constant struggle. But ultimately, this battle to find a way to get on top of how social media promotes anti-Semitism it's absolutely essential, in the same way it is of in so many other struggles, whether it's tackling other forms of prejudice, whether it's about, you know, anti-vaxxers, or whether it's about content on TikTok promoting self-harm to teenagers, this kind of thing. It all comes back to the same root.
Yep. My camera isn't working, so you can't see me nodding furiously. It's this that keeps me awake at night. It's this social media problem that we have, and I worry about it for minority groups, of course, including the Jewish community, but also young people. I've got 2 young kids, and I'm deeply concerned about the role that social media plays in our life. My kids are only 2 and 4, but I'm telling you now, they're not getting social media ever while they live under this roof. So I'm really concerned about it, and I recognise exactly what David said in terms of young people today, because they have unprecedented access to all of this content. In relation to anti-Semitism, they have little or no knowledge of the history, of the complexity of it, but they've got access to all of this kind of conspiracy stuff, and they're, you know, cynically, well, and they share it. It's quite often, you know, misguided good faith, but they don't have the skills, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the understanding to analyze it, and to come up with their own conclusions on things. So I'm deeply worried about it, and I think we are living in a new anti-Semitic age, and that is because of social media, and the impact that has. So I think it's really about how enforcement is delivered, and we need social media companies to enforce their policies properly, and it's not necessarily about content, it's about the systems that they have in place that deliver that enforcement. So of course, many people see lots of horrific content, but, you know, what are the systems around that? What are the risk assessments? What are the hashtags that are people using to disseminate harmful content and a seemingly not harmful hashtags? So there's all of the stuff around that. We're particularly concerned about small high harm platforms, because at the moment Ofcom and the government kind of looks at more the size of them rather than the harm that's on them. So we want some kind of closer regulation over categorization of social media, and that's something that I've spoken to and had a meeting with the Secretary of State about recently. But there's other stuff as well around the effort of the police to deal with individuals who are circulating harmful content. But it's a really complex, it's one that I'm deeply worried about, and it's hugely complex, and it's going to involve Ofcom and looking at the Digital Safety Act and ensuring that that's delivered properly. But I think we could spend a long time on this. But suffice to say that this is the most frightening driver of anti-Semitism and a lot of societal ills at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And moving on to our next question is about the protests that have been taking place. So with the recent pro-Israel and pro-Palestine protests in the UK, where do you both believe that the line should be drawn between free speech and hate speech? Dave, just start off.
This is always a contentious one, and it's always to a certain extent a subjective one, because look, there will be some examples of hate speech that are so obviously abusive and threatening, and in this case, racially insulting, that no one would argue with it. But there are lots of examples of speech, you know, when it comes to anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred, a lot of it is expressed through stereotypes and tropes and references to historic myths, things like the blood libel and the protocols of the Elders of Zion and well poisonings that come from, in some cases, many hundreds of years ago, and that many people may well not be aware of. Many of the listeners to this may not fully understand what even those three things I've mentioned are really all about. And yet anti-Semites know what they are, and Jewish people know what they are. And so when they get shouted, whether it's in the street or whether it's written on, or on a march, or whether it's on social media or on a placard or something, Jewish people, the potential, targets or victims of this hate crime will understand it as completely hateful. But the police might not quite understand it. The CPS might need help having it explained to them. A jury or a magistrate certainly may need expert advice on it. And it's because these ideas circulate so much in society and have been around for so long, and social media makes them so accessible. The people posting it or shouting it may not even themselves fully understand what they mean, what the roots of these things are. So, we've seen a lot of prosecutions for hate speech over the last year or so, some of them related to October the 7th and subsequent war and so on, and some of the placards and chants on some of the pro-Palestine protests. We've also seen a lot of prosecutions coming out of the riots following Southport and the violent disorder over the summer. And some of these prosecutions will be close to a line where people will disagree, I think, over what is free speech and what is hate speech. Now, the way our laws are currently written, I think on the whole work quite well, because they do focus on the impact of speech. A lot of people assume if something is anti-Semitic, it must be illegal. And that isn't right. That isn't true. It's not illegal to hold a racist opinion or even to express a racist view. It's illegal if you express it in a certain way, in a certain context, using certain types of language that is threatening, that causes harassment, alarm and distress, that incites hatred and so on. So it focuses on the impact. Now, even then, there's a lot of ambiguity. And there have been cases gone through the courts recently that have ended in an acquittal, and where once someone is found not guilty, the response of a lot of people is always to say, well, this case should never have been brought. And I think that misses the point. The point of bringing a case is to let the courts make the ultimate decision. And especially with something where you're regulating speech, it has to be fully tested in court. And if the police and the CPS only brought cases that were 100% guaranteed to get a conviction, then I don't think people would be satisfied with that. I think a lot of stuff would be let go that most people would consider to be hateful. So it's a very grey area. It's a very difficult area. And there's a lot of, especially in the context of the pro-Palestinian protests, a lot of the chants and a lot of the language that have caused the most upset in the Jewish community, things like calls for intifada, chants saying Israel has to go, this chant from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, which a lot of Jewish people understand to mean between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, which is where Israel currently is, there shouldn't be an Israel at all. It should all be Palestine. Other people interpret that chant differently. But we often focus in on, are these criminal? And are these criminal is not always the same question or same thing as, are they hateful? They can be hateful in different ways. They can inspire fear in people, but not actually reach a criminal threshold for prosecution. And I think, again, that's where, to a certain extent, we have to take responsibility for the impact that our language, the language of movements we're in, demonstrations we're on, has on other communities and on wider society, and not just hide behind the fact, well, if the police don't arrest and the CPS don't prosecute, then everything is fine.
I find that it's quite an interesting debate, and I did a philosophy degree, and so I come at it from that kind of perspective. And I think too often we focus on the free speech element of it and not the harm element of it, not necessarily from a legal sense, but from a societal perspective, what harm is, what that means. And if you kind of take it back to John Stuart Mill, then that's a really good starting place, I think. And on these marches, and this is an important thing that for me, from my perspective, because growing up the left, I know lots of anti-Semites, and I have to always bear in mind, so that I don't completely lose faith in humanity, that you get kind of two types, and it comes in this question as well, but also when you're thinking about education, that you've got those who repeat things, as I said before, in kind of misguided good faith, who sincerely believe certain conspiracy theories, for example, and those who cynically exploit and are clearly and demonstrably motivated by hatred. But then you're getting into people's intentions rather than just the consequences, and that gets you into a minefield of quite difficult debate. In terms of the marches, lots of people were really unhappy with how the police effort around them, and I think there has been certainly some steps to improve that. I would think it's really important that the organisers of these marches do more, and that we see a concerted effort, not to make sure that the marches are legal, but that they aren't harmful in the widest sense of the world. Where are their policies around an approach to anti-Semitism or hateful speech on the marches, whether it's intentional or not? And we've not heard very much about that in the whole debate around the Gaza marches, and I would like to see some more discussion on that, and I would like to see the organisers take more responsibility into making sure that these are free from hate, regardless of intention behind or education of the people who are on those marches, and we saw absolutely none of that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so I think much of our topic and this topic of discussion is focused on kind of the issues at stake. And so just to wrap things up, I think leaving it on kind of a better note and a more optimistic note would be to talk about solutions. So just a question on education as a tool to kind of counter disinformation and stereotypes, and any other kind of solutions to this issue. Yeah, Dave, could you start us off, please?
Look, we always turn to education as
an
answer, right? Because look, it's a positive answer, it's an optimistic answer, and we need to always remind ourselves, most people are appalled by the idea of racism or by the idea of any minority feeling excluded and fearful, which is always, a good start. And it's also impossible to, when we're talking about ideas that are quite widespread and these big trends and shifts in society, you can't deal with it only through enforcement. You can arrest the most serious cases, but especially when we're talking about young people and social media, education has to be part of the solution. It's really important, though, to think very clearly and I think smartly and also self-critically about what we're educating, what and how and in what context. We have fantastic Holocaust education in schools in this country. I think we've learned over the years that doesn't really quite help deal with the sort of anti-Semitism we're looking at now, because it's a very different sort of anti-Semitism. There's not much knowledge. There are not many Jewish people living in this country. There's only about 300,000. Most people in Britain don't really know any Jewish people. So that's a whole area of education about just Jewish life and Jewish history and the role Jewish people have played in this country over many centuries. The whole issue of tackling sort of digital media literacy, how to spot misinformation, how to critically assess the source of information online. In some ways, if we can crack that nut, that might help tackle anti-Semitism amongst younger people more than any specific anti-Semitism education would. And then there's the issue of, is school the best place to do this? Or are there better places and better sources through which to educate? Who are the most powerful messengers that young people are listening to? And can we access and harness those voices? Quite often part of the problem is that a lot of the people having these discussions and making these decisions are so much older than the young people they're talking about. They have no idea who, even their kids are listening to online. So these are all the kind of things that I think when we talk about education, and then we have to also just be a bit humble with this, because, you know, we often think education is the answer, but there is so much anti-Semitism in universities where our most educated people are, that what if the wrong kind of education actually makes things worse? So broadly speaking, yes, I always try and be optimistic and look for positive solutions, and education is the obvious one. But with all those caveats, just what are we actually trying to teach? How do we best do it? Who are the best conveyors of that message, and in what context, and so
on? Yes, I mean, not got very much to add to that. I mean, education is always seen as the silver bullet, and I suppose to a degree it is. But education to address this issue has to go much further than, as David said, Holocaust or Jewish education, which is necessary but not sufficient. I mean, if we look at what we were talking about before, which is the real driver being social media. I mean, I was so disappointed that digital citizenship education was taken out of the online safety bill, but because kids, that's where they're getting it. And if we don't tackle the problem with social media and young people accessing it and believing it, then this problem's only going to get worse and worse and worse. So we need proper digital citizenship education, so that everyone can identify from a really young age conspiracy theories, what's a good source of information, a bad source of information. I mean, my little sister's 25. They get all their news from basically from social media, and they can't tell the difference between, you know, a reliable source of information and one that isn't. But underneath all of that is the ability to think critically and have good, well, I suppose philosophical critical thinking skills, which is in part education. Well, almost. But in this very, very widest sense, yes, it's not just about what happens in the classroom. I've lost my train of thought there. There was something else that I was going to say, which it might come back to me. But being able to recognise anti-Semitism, to think critically about it, is really important, and how you enable young people to do that is within the classroom, but cultural elements as well. So it's quite complex.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks both.